What can we learn from the life of Joseph? Joseph was the 11th son of Jacob, his first son through his favored wife, Rachel. Joseph's story is found in Genesis chapter 37 through 50. After the announcement of his birth, we see Joseph next as a 17-year-old returning from shepherding the flock with his half-brothers to give Jacob a bad report of them. We are also told that Jacob loved Joseph more than any of his other sons because he had been born to him in his old age, and he made an ornate robe for him. Genesis chapter 37 verse 3. Joseph's brothers knew their father loved Joseph more than them, which caused them to hate him. Genesis chapter 37 verse 4. To make matters worse, Joseph began relating his dreams to the family, prophetic visions showing Joseph one day ruling over his family. Genesis chapter 37 verse 5 through 11. The animosity towards Joseph peaked when his brothers plotted to kill him in the wilderness. Reuben, the eldest, objected to outright murder and suggested they throw Joseph into a cistern, as he planned to come back and rescue the boy. But in Reuben's absence, some merchants passed by, and Judah suggested selling Joseph into slavery. The brothers accomplished the task before Reuben could rescue him. The boys took Joseph's robe and, after dipping the robe in goat's blood, deceived their father into thinking his favorite son had been slain by wild beasts. Genesis chapter 37, verse 18 through 35. Joseph was sold by the merchants to a high-ranking Egyptian named Potiphar, and eventually became the supervisor of Potiphar's household. In Genesis chapter 39, we read of how Joseph excelled at his duties, became one of Potiphar's most trusted servants, and was put in charge of his household. Potiphar could see that whatever Joseph did, God looked favorably on him, and he prospered in all that he did. Unfortunately, Potiphar's wife attempted to seduce Joseph. Joseph constantly refused her advances, showing honor for the master who had entrusted him with so much, and saying that it would be a wicked thing and a sin against God for him to go to bed with Potiphar's wife. Genesis chapter 39 verse 9. One day, Potiphar's wife caught Joseph by the cloak and again made sexual advances. Joseph fled, leaving his cloak in her hand. In danger, she falsely accused Joseph of attempted rape, and Potiphar put him in prison. Genesis chapter 39, verse 7 through 20. In jail, Joseph was again blessed by God. Genesis chapter 39, verse 21 through 23. Joseph interpreted the dreams of two of his fellow prisoners. Both interpretations proved to be true, and one of the men was later released from jail and restored to his position as the king's cupbearer. Genesis chapter 40, verse 1 to 23. But the cupbearer forgot about Joseph and failed to speak to Pharaoh about him. 2 years later, the king himself had some troubling dreams, and the cupbearer remembered Joseph's gift of interpretation. The king summoned Joseph and related his dreams. Based on Pharaoh's dreams, Joseph predicted 7 years of bountiful harvests, followed by 7 years of severe famine in Egypt, and advised the king to begin storing grain in preparation for the coming dearth. Genesis chapter 41, verse 1 to 37. For his wisdom, Joseph was made ruler in Egypt, second only to the king. Joseph was in charge of storing up food during the years of plenty and selling it to the Egyptians and foreigners during the years of famine. Genesis chapter 41, verse 38 through 57. During these years of plenty, Joseph had two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. Genesis chapter 41, verse 50 to 52. When the famine struck, even Canaan was affected. Joseph sent 10 of his sons to Egypt to buy grain. Genesis chapter 42, verse 1 through 3. He kept Benjamin, his youngest and the only other son of Rachel, behind. Genesis chapter 42, verse 4. While in Egypt, the men met their long-lost brother, whom they did not recognize. Joseph, however, did recognize his brothers. He tested them by accusing them of being spies. He confined them for 3 days, then released all but one, sending with them grain for their households, and requiring them to come back with their youngest brother. Genesis chapter 42, verse 6 through 20. Still unaware of Joseph's identity, the brothers were afflicted with guilt for having sold their brother years before. Genesis chapter 42, verse 21 to 22. Joseph overheard their discussion and turned aside to weep. Genesis chapter 42, verse 23 through 24. He restrained Simeon and sent the others on their way, secretly returning their money to their grain sacks. Genesis chapter 42, verse 25. When the brothers later realized the money had been returned, they feared even more. Genesis chapter 42, verse 26 through 28 and 35. Once home, they told Jacob all that had conspired. Jacob mourned again the loss of Joseph and the added loss of Simeon. He refused to send Benjamin, despite Reuben's promise that if he did not return with Benjamin, Jacob could kill Reuben's two sons. Genesis chapter 42, verse 35 through 38. The famine became so severe that Jacob acquiesced. Judah persuaded Jacob to send Benjamin with him, giving his own life as a pledge. Genesis chapter 43, verse 1 through 10. Jacob agreed, sending also choice fruits and double the money for the grain. Genesis chapter 43, verse 11 to 14. When Joseph saw the men, he instructed his servants to slaughter an animal and prepare a meal for the brothers to dine with him. Genesis chapter 43, verse 15 through 17. Afraid at the invitation of Joseph's house, the brothers made apologies to Joseph's steward for the money that had been replaced the first time. Joseph's steward reassured them and brought Simeon out. Genesis chapter 43, verse 18 through 25. When Joseph returned, the brothers bowed to him, fulfilling his earlier prophecy. Genesis chapter 43, verse 25. He asked about their family's welfare and again wept, this time removing himself to his chamber. Genesis chapter 43, verse 27 through 30. When the men sat down for the meal at a separate table from Joseph, they were amazed to be arranged by birth order. Benjamin was given 5 times the portion the other brothers received. Genesis chapter 43, verse 31 through 34. Before sending them back to their father, Joseph again tested his brothers by returning their money to their grain sacks and placing his silver cup in Benjamin's sack. He let the brothers start on their journey and then sent his steward after them to frying anger and threatened to kill Benjamin. Back in Joseph's presence, Judah fled for Benjamin's life, saying that if Benjamin were to die, so would Jacob. Judah told of Jacob's grief over the loss of Joseph and his belief that he could not bear to lose Joseph's brother. Judah also spoke of his pledge to Jacob and offered his life for Benjamin's. Genesis chapter 44. Upon seeing this proof of the brothers' change of heart, Joseph sent all his servants away and wept openly and loudly enough to be heard by Pharaoh's household. He then revealed himself to his brothers. Genesis chapter 45, verse 1 to 3. Joseph immediately reassured them, telling them not to be angry with themselves for what they'd done to him, and saying that God had sent him to Egypt in order to preserve them. Genesis chapter 45, verse 4 to 8. Joseph reaffirmed his forgiveness years later after the death of his father, saying that although his brothers intended evil to him, God had intended it for good. Genesis chapter 50, verse 15 through 21. Joseph sent his brothers back to Jacob to retrieve the remainder of his household to come live in Goshen, where they would be near to Joseph and he would provide for them. Genesis chapter 45:9, chapter 47:12. Jacob did come to live in Egypt with all of his family before he died. Jacob blessed Joseph's 2 sons and gave thanks to God for his goodness. I never expected to see your face again, and now God has allowed me to see your children too. Genesis chapter 48, verse 11. Jacob gave the greatest blessing to the younger of the 2 sons, verses 12 through 20. Later in the history of Israel, Ephraim and Manasseh, the tribes of Joseph, were often considered 2 distinct tribes. Joseph's descendants lived in Egypt for 400 years, until the time of Moses. When Moses led the Hebrews out of Egypt, he took the remains of Joseph with him, as Joseph has requested. Genesis chapter 50, verse 24 to 25. Exodus chapter 13, verse 19. There is much to learn from Joseph's story. As parents, we have warnings concerning Jacob's favoritism and the effects that can have on other children, as seen in Joseph's youthful pride and his brothers' envy and hatred. We have a good example of how to handle sexual temptation. Run. Genesis chapter 39, verse 12. 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 22. And we have a clear picture of God's faithfulness. He does not forsake his children, even in the midst of suffering. The Lord was with Joseph. Genesis chapter 39, verse 3, 5, 21, and 23. There may be many distressing circumstances we find ourselves in, and some of them may even be unjust, as were those in Joseph's life. However, as we learn from the account of Joseph's life, by remaining faithful and accepting that God is ultimately in charge, we can be confident that God will reward our faithfulness in the fullness of time. Who would blame Joseph if he had turned his brothers away in their need? Yet Joseph showed them mercy, and God desires that we exercise mercy above all other sacrifices. Hosea chapter 6, verse 6, Matthew chapter 9, verse 13. Joseph's story also presents amazing insight into how to overcome evil and bring about his plan. After all his ordeals, Joseph was able to see God's hand at work. As he revealed his identity to his brothers, Joseph spoke of their sin this way: Do not be distressed, and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. It was not you who sent me here, but God. Genesis chapter 45, verse 5 and 8. Later, Joseph again reassured his brothers, offering forgiveness and saying, You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good. Genesis chapter 50, verse 20. Man's most wicked intentions can never thwart the perfect plan of God.